Hello and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pitts. This is a Ukraine War Update Extra video to give you the tidbits and nuggets to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. Lots of stuff I was supposed to talk about yesterday but didn't have time because I talked too much. Well, let's do that again today. And I actually recorded this yesterday, so when I say today, I mean yesterday, and today is tomorrow. If you get my meaning? Anyway, let's go into look at Belarus to start with. So this is this is on Yahoo News. This is Michael Weiss again and Holger Runemar. Revealed leaked document shows how Russia plans to take over Belarus. I'm just going to go into the beginnings of this and not go into the crazy detail of the whole article, but I think this is pretty fascinating, and I wonder how this will play in Belarus. I wonder, A, people will find out about this, B, whether people like Lukashenko will, I mean, surely he'll find out about this and where he thinks he stands. I think he must feel pretty powerless at the moment because he's lost the general public, who, he's a dictator who's been effectively reinstalled by Putin. And at one stage he did have power, like a power that was independently and personally forged by himself. But now that power has been maintained by Putin and Russia, and actually he's lost the support of the people generally and is holding on as a dictator. So he might find out about this and think, well, there's really sort of all I can do about it, and might as well just go for it because it becomes uh, a decision of existential. It's an existential decision, isn't it? It's like if I look at this and go, oh, I don't want this, and I had to move away from what Russia wants, in which case I'll be assassinated. I will cease to exist. So, Lukashenko's only options these days are to toe the party line as far as Putin is concerned, as little as he can, to give himself still his own kind of space and place in the world, but he needs to do just about enough to appease to Russia, and that's what he's to appease Russia, and that's what he's been doing so far. But if Russia are now saying, well, actually, we see your futures completely in our sphere of influence, then the as little as he can to appease Russia is basically irrelevant. He will just be doing exactly what Russia bids, going forward. If you get my drift there. So the article says the document outlines in granular detail, this leaked document, a creeping annexation by political, economic, and military means of an independent but illiberal European nation by Russia, which is which is an active state of war in its bid to conquer Ukraine through overwhelming force. Russia's goals with regards to Belarus are the same as with Ukraine, Michael Carpenter, the US ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, told Yahoo News. Only in Belarus it relies on coercion. Only in Belarus it relies on coercion rather than war. Its end goal is still wholesale incorporation. So where Russia are invading Ukraine to get them under their sphere of influence and to make them part of the empire of Russia, if you like, uh, it won't be done by war, but it will be done by coercion with Belarus. It will still be, incorporated against its democratic will. According to the document issued in autumn 2021, the end goal is the formation of a so-called union state of Russia and Belarus by no later than 2030. Everything involved in the merger of the two countries has been considered, including the harmonization of Belarusian laws with those of the Russian Federation, a coordinated foreign and defense policy, and trade and economic cooperation on the basis of the priority of Russian interests, and ensuring the predominant influence of the Russian Federation in the socio-political, trade, economic, scientific, educational, and cultural information spheres. Wow. So basically, everything. In practice, this would eliminate whatever remains of Belarus's sovereignty and reduce a country about the size of Kansas, with 9.3 million people, to the status of a Moscow satellite. It would put Belarusians at the mercy of the Kremlin's priorities, whether in agriculture, infantry, espionage, or war, and it would lose a security threat. Sorry, it would pose a security threat to Belarus's European neighbours, three of which, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, are members of NATO and the European Union. So if Belarus became part of Russia, then Russia really would be bordering quite a few NATO countries, and actually that'd be pretty interesting. Anyway, Lukashenko, it's kind of like this puppet stuck in the middle, and his country appeared to be on the brink of being assimilated into this Russian Union. We'll see how that goes. Europe's most remarkable response to Russia's war on Ukraine has been the unprecedented speed of an energy transition that in 1 year has nearly eliminated its dependence on Russian fossil fuels. So this is referring to a Bloomberg article, which is a very interesting read. How Europe ditched Russian fossil fuels with spectacular speed. Europe has changed Russia from its biggest source of imported energy to a bit player. Lots to talk about here. You might think the shift has been, well, it presented a great opportunity to green up the energy industry, although the industry has some incredible lobbying capability, and it has its control over very many politicians around the world. Uh, the US is no exception here. I wrote an article sometime back about how the green industries get no subsidization at all compared to the fossil fuel industries. The fossil fuel industries, and indeed the nuclear industry, actually, it gets huge subsidization. But the fossil fuel industries get so much government money and government help, and they don't need that help. They are an established industry that are raking in the dollars. They don't need subsidization. But when you factor in negative externalities, so these are external costs to the production of a good that are incurred, those costs are borne by essentially governments and therefore taxpayers, then the subsidization of fossil fuel industries is to the tune of like 653 billion dollars a year or something, as according to a Forbes article some years back. But it's really interesting when you see how much, So when I talk about negative externalities, an example, I explained this before, but say I don't know, an oil, say the oil spill in the Gulf. Sometime back, or just talk about rivers or slag heaps leaking into water courses or whatever. So you're digging coal or drilling for oil, and in doing that, you like pollute a bunch of rivers or sea, right? Now, if anyone else has to come in, if anyone else has to pay for that spillage, that pollution, and incidentally, some of that, the quantification of those costs in terms of like birds covered in oil and dying is hard to put a figure on, right? I mean, the negative externality of that, external cost of the organization that to that animal is death, right? That's the external cost. It's pretty big. But if the government says, right, we're going to come in and we'll spend a huge amount of money helping to clean that up, yeah, you'll bear a lot of the cost, but we'll help clean it up. Then charities are involved in this and that. All the costs involved in cleaning up that pollution or the water courses, if it's not entirely borne out by the company producing that, then they are making profit on the back of other people paying for them being able to create their product and doing stuff that's costing other people to sort out or to pay for. And that's called a negative externality. And the problem is the free market cannot arbitrate for negative externality. So what happens is governments have to come in and regulate. You have to have regulation, because if you don't, you'll have children working down the mines. This is what happened in the Industrial Revolution. And you had free marketeers at the time saying, we want children to work down mines, otherwise our profits will go. And the government saying, we don't want children working down mines because it's bad. And then that's how schooling came about. It's like, what do we do with children? Well, let's start schooling up and let's educate them. We want so on and so forth. Anyway, so you had all this regulation, the Factories Act, the Agricultural Gangs Act, the Climbing Boys Act, and all this stuff in the Industrial Revolution to stop the cost on society of these of making that product. And the cost there was like the cost to childhood and the cost of education and blah blah blah. But there are other types of, lots of types of costs. Anyway, the free market can't deal with that unless the consumer demands it, and that's not going to, generally doesn't happen when consumers are price driven. This is all going to come back to Ukraine. Don't worry. So what my point is that this war with Ukraine was a great opportunity for us to sort out um, our energy sector so that it was sustainable, so that it wasn't polluting, because we're sick of having to pay for that, uh, and the cost that that the cost of that to the environment, to societies, to biodiversity, all this kind of stuff, right? So this is a great opportunity. Let's get off Russian gas and oil, and then, hey, yeah, maybe nuclear is a backbone, but let's get loads more solar, let's get loads more wind, etc., etc. And this would have been a great opportunity. Instead, what happened is everyone went, right, we don't want Russian oil and gas. Let's go and get oil and gas from Qatar and UAE and Venezuela. I was like, yeah, but no, we've got a really good opportunity to like change things up here and make this a better world going forward. And don't hit me with you can't drive tractors on electricity and all this kind of stuff. Yes, there's a place for fossil fuels still, but it's about weaning off that and developing new technologies that will be able to, needs must, necessity is a mother of all invention, so on and so forth. So here's our opportunity, but we didn't take it. But we have shifted off Russian hydrocarbons. Really, really interesting. So the shift has been far from the kind of climate first transition that Europe has envisioned for its long term future, with governments paying whatever it takes to secure liquefied sources of natural gas brought in by ships, burning more coal and ripping through some environmental plans in the process. And it's been painful, with Europe getting hit by roughly a $1 trillion energy bill last year, cushioned by hundreds of billions of euros of government subsidies. Matters could have been worse if it weren't for Europe's transition to clean energy that had begun in earnest years ago. That's one reason why, even as the bloc prioritized any source of energy that was not Russian, emissions in 2022 decreased slightly rather than increasing. And there was also a significant contribution from warm weather, thanks to climate change, that cut demand for heating, and from polluting industries that simply shut down because they couldn't afford to pay for the energy needed to operate. But what the past year has shown is that it's possible to go harder and faster in deploying solar panels and batteries, reducing energy use, and permanently swapping out entrenched sources of fossil fuel. So the record amount of green technology came on board in 2022, as according to Bloomberg NEF. Um, uh, Solar installations across Europe increased by a record 40 gigawatts last year, up 35% compared to 2021. The jump, though, was driven primarily by consumers who saw cheap solar panels as a way to cut their own energy bills. So this is one way of changing uh, markets, is by having it consumer driven, but it's just more difficult. So if you look at LED lights compared to old incandescent light bulbs, so yeah, you can try and enthuse people to use LED light bulbs or whatever, but that wasn't really happening. So the government, this happened in the UK and the EU, said, right, tungsten filament light bulbs are now, we're regulating them, you can't use them. So then everyone's like, okay, well, we'll produce really decent lights that are much more sustainable. And that's what happened. So you regulate, and then technology follows along because it has to adapt to the regulation. The EU did this with vacuum hoovers. So vacuums in the EU, they used to be like 2,000 watt, or it could be however powerful you wanted. Then the EU said, right, maximum 1,700. Then that went down to 1,400 watts, and so on and so forth. And everyone's like, oh, we can't have powerful hoovers. But actually, what happened is, and here's my anecdote here, I bought a Hoover that was 900 watts. And I was kind of annoyed at this because I like a really good, powerful Hoover to do my hoovering. It turned out that just like fairly shortly after they'd introduced these regulations, the vacuum companies went away and said, okay, exactly why they introduced the regulation. We need to now design motors that are far more efficient. So they designed these motors that are far more efficient and in line with the regulation. And I got a 900 watt vacuum that was more powerful than my old 2000 watt vacuum that I bought only 2 years before. Right. So in that time period, they'd improved the efficiency of the motors and the suction of the motors for far less power. This is quite incredible. So, yes, consumers can drive decision making, but it's much quicker to get it done through regulation. It essentially pushes solar rollout ahead by a few years, hitting a level that will be sustained by EU policies. The acceleration came ahead of the EU's new solar incentives, which probably haven't really kicked in yet, said Jenny Chase, analyst for BNEF. It's Bloomberg. Everything in solar has just happened because of consumer demand. Wind power also increased, but could not match projections. Inflation held back wind more than solar. And then what happened to fossil fuel? Well, basically, Russia's pipelines got turned off. Nord Stream, won't go into that for the moment, but almost 1 year after Russia launched its war of aggression against Ukraine, the EU economy is on a better footing than expected in autumn, the European Commission said in its most recent economic report. So economically, the EU is actually in a pretty good place considering where it could be. Inflation appears to have peaked, and favorable developments in energy markets foreshadow further forceful declines. Some of the Russian gas was replaced by increased pipeline flows from Algeria and Norway. Most came on ships in the form of LNG or liquefied natural gas. We made it through sucking up every last drop of spot LNG. Securing all that gas meant buying up lots more from the US and Qatar. This feeds into the theory that the US blew up Nord Stream pipelines because they've stood to gain an awful lot from increased LNG imports but then counter arguments, whatever, don't want to get into that. Nearly doubling EU's LNG imports compared to 2021. Warm temperatures have meant more gas in storage available for next winter as well. So that's a bonus going forwards. So the import of LNG, as you can see, into Europe has really gone up as different countries have switched away from Russia. Some gas demand was reduced by burning more coal in power plants. Coal use across the European Union rose 7% last year as Russian imports declined through the year and came almost to a complete halt in October after sanctions kicked in. So this is Russian coal imports into Europe, and as you can see, bosh. So the thing is, they're still going to be selling that, but they'll be selling that at a much lower rate to somewhere else in the world. The greatest help came in the form of reduction in demand from both industry and homes. As the price of gas shot up, some industries, such as fertilizer producers, found it uneconomical to operate, while others found alternatives to meet their energy needs. That led to an 18% decline in use over 2021, comparable to the 14% drop seen in 2020 compared to with the year before. Now, sidebar, Germany was really worried about sanctions put on Russian hydrocarbons because some of their massive big industries were like, we cannot continue to operate needing this huge amount of energy. You can't do it on renewables, you can't do it on this, blah, blah, blah. So in the short term, we really need this. But actually what they found is they could cope. And some of these big industries, I remember listening to Ukraine, the latest podcast, talking to some German experts saying that some of these big manufacturing plants were able to cut their energy usage by 50%. Again, necessity is a mother of all invention. It's like, okay, we really need to cut energy. How can we cut energy? How can we be more efficient? How can we do this? All right, we absolutely need to. Like before, we were just, oh yeah, let's keep paying for that. We'll keep our prices up. Yeah. Now it's like we can't keep doing that. We literally can't. So how do we work this out? Oh, it turns out that when we really put our minds to it, we can reduce our energy usage by 50%. Wow. So and that's actually shown in the needing less from Russia. So it's not just about like getting things from other sources, but it's actually reducing our energy consumption. The story was similar for residential heating, which also fell 15%, according to data compiled by Bloomberg NEF from Europe's biggest gas consuming countries. At the same time, sales of heat pumps rapidly increased across most European countries that have reported data from Sweden to Poland. Early estimates suggest continent wide sales may have increased 38% over 2021. Heat pumps are highly efficient, which means they require a lot less energy and are thus cheaper to run. So heat pumps appear to be the future. Like there's regulation going on in the UK, I think, with some new builds and getting sources of energy from either solar panels and heat pumps and stuff like that. All that's a kind of sensible regulation, I think, that's really useful. Oil imports also saw a decline into 2022, but not as much as coal or gas. Total imports from Russia fell by 300,000 barrels a day, which kept the country as the biggest exporter of oil to the EU. So still the biggest exporter of oil to the EU. Russia, but falling by 300,000 barrels a day. That is no small number. Russian oil imports should finally come to a halt a year later. Okay, so again, you know, the direction of travel is pretty obvious there. Imports from Russia have been replaced by increased shipments from the US, Saudi Arabia, and Norway. The EU also worked with the group of 7 countries and Australia to impose a price cap on Russian crude of $60 a barrel in December. That is meant to allow Russian oil to flow around the world, but deprive Putin of windfall profits if the market price soars. So we still needed that supply, because if you completely cut off the supply, then you can actually send the world into a recession, and that's counterproductive. So what you want is Russia to still be selling that oil to the world market, but at an amount that means they aren't making crazy profits. So if you can cap that at $60 a barrel, and in fact it's been operating at sort of 35 to 45 for a lot of the time, then you're meaning they're budgeted for somewhere around $70 a barrel, or maybe more, I can't remember. And that's depriving them of apparently about $160 million a day, which is phenomenal. So that is one way of being able to deal with the Russian energy situation. Anyway, it goes on to say, what's the future? Nuclear, this and that, and it's all about switching away. At the end of the day, I mean, you have this thing called peak oil. I don't know how much you guys know about that. So peak oil is the idea that there's only a finite amount of oil. We're going to reach a peak of usage, and then it's all downhill from there. And if you're not, there's something called the transition movement, but which is talking about if you're not prepared for moving away from oil, you're going to get screwed over. So whether you like it or not, oil is going to come to an end, right? Whether it's now, 50 years, 100 years, or whatever, it's probably better to be organized and prepared for that rather than just keep relying on oil, then at some point realizing, oh shite, there's none left, and we're not prepared and we're screwed. So it's being sensible. So you might as well do that now, like get that transition sorted, because it's actually better for the environment, and then technology will catch up with that. Say, okay, right, normally we have tractors that require, and big engines that require this kind of fuel and that grunt. How can we do that? Can we put our minds to producing? And now there are tractors that are the first electric tractors in Europe have been produced and stuff like that. So it's like, I don't think it's good enough to say, oh, but we can't we can't get off oil because of X, Y, and Z. Necessity is the mother of all invention. So the mother of invention, whatever, you know what I mean. So if you have to get off oil, go and work out a way to do that, and then they go away. Companies will go away and say, right, we need tractors. We still need tractors. How can we get tractors that have the grunt of a diesel engine or whatever, but they're electric? Right, let's work it out. Let's do it. And 5 years later, bish bash bosh, you've got a tractor that works off electric. So trains can do it, so on and so forth. Where there's a will, there's a way. Anyway, that's the energy situation as I see it in Ukraine. I just want to show you, or not in Ukraine, in Europe actually, with regard to Russia and its energy production. I just want to show you this HIMARS, because it looks like a pod of 6. Normally you get 6 rockets on a HIMARS. This one seems to have stopped, unless it's already fired off 4, but there's no smoke in the air. And it fires off 2, and they look somewhat bigger than HIMARS rockets. And some of you guys are more expert on this than I am, but I think this is interesting. So this has stopped and has only fired 2 rockets. Right, and by the time the smoke clears from those 2 rockets, it's already put its pods down. And they look slightly bigger rockets to me. Oh, so I missed it. So I don't know. That looks bigger than a HIMARS rocket. I'd just be interested as to whether that is a bigger rocket being sent from a Gimler's. Let me know. Interested to note a news report in Crimea. Why would they suddenly need a new hospital in Sevastopol? There will be a blood transfusion specialist service and an oxygen station, among other medical needs. Looks like many incoming new mobilized visitors are due. This is a good point, right? What inference is the best explanation? Abductive argument. What best explains the data? Is requiring a new hospital best explained by wanting to improve the welfare of the citizens within Crimea, and maybe there's more citizens coming and you need a new hospital? Or is it because you've got so many people dying and being injured in a massive war, just a massive influx of wounded people, that you need to put all those things in place? I think probably the latter. The twisted logic of how NATO is to blame for Russia starting this war, starting wars. Think of it this way: you live next door to a violent psychopath who has attacked you and all of your neighbors. Then you decide to reinforce your doors and windows. You are the aggressor, really. So countries that were invaded by Russia or the USSR. So 1939, Finland, and then you got the Baltics. You got you got Ukraine, you've got Poland, you've got Germany, you've got Bulgaria, so on and so forth. And then further down south towards Turkey, I presume that's going to be Armenia area and whatnot. So, uh, yeah, it's like, oh yeah, NATO is starting all these wars, NATO expansion, mate. Look at your history. Look at really what you like. Look at your imperialism, and have a little think about that. Uh, and just to uh, finish off, 25 minutes is going to be a half one. I'll do another one probably just on Putin's speech. But here's just an interesting little one to finish off with. During Prohibition, nothing to do with the Ukraine war, Winston Churchill got a prescription to drink alcohol when visiting the United States. I love this. This is to certify that the post-accident convalescence of the Honourable Winston S. Churchill necessitates the use of alcoholic spirits, especially at mealtimes. The quantity is naturally indefinite, but the minimum requirements would be 250 cubic centimeters. Signed, Otto C. Pickhart, MD. The church. So it's just like wonderful. I really hope this is true and not some kind of fake. But yeah, prohibition. But I need to drink my whiskey and smoke my cigars. Get me a doctor's note. Okay, Winston. Roger that. Anyway, thank you. That was just a bit of a long ramble through some energy conversations and economic discussion. I hope there's either of use or interesting, or preferably both. Um, Stay tuned, because I will produce the second half to this in a short while.